Okay, it is 12 o'clock, so I am going to get started. Happy Tuesday that feels like a Monday. I am Melissa Maloney. We are so excited to have you join us for our final of 8 sessions that we've been doing for our Double Take series. And today we are talking about conflict and confrontation and all the fun stuff. Jen, you want to say hi to the peeps?
Hello, people. How are you? I hope everyone is doing well. You're going to get a lot out of today. I just know it. So nice seeing you. I'm going in the back.
Awesome. Jen's in charge of the background today. So, like I said, this is our 8th session that we have in our series. And today we're going to focus on approaching conflict with confidence and emotional intelligence, really focusing on how can we turn sort of conflict into an opportunity as opposed to being scared of it. So I really want us to sort of think about the bigger journey that we've been on. So as we've kind of been working through these sessions, there was an order to it. There was sort of a method to our madness. And on my side of the sessions, we really set it up from the standpoint of if we give people really good processes and then help them with clear expectations and then hold them accountable to those expectations, the goal would be that we not have to get into these sort of, I'll say, tough conversations, the conversations that are what a lot of us probably feel are the yucky conversations. However, the reality is they still happen, and they don't need to be something that we hide away from. They can be something we approach and really lean into. And in Jen's session, she's really focused on building our own confidence and the way that we look at things ourselves, again, as sort of that logical thing that as leaders, how do we make all of this come together and align the way that we hope that it will. So the reality is, in terms of what we're looking for, conflict itself is typically not the enemy. It's not the bad thing. What tends to damage teams and what can lead to challenges for us is really, and I'll say those things that sort of pull away at the trust and like drains the teams and all of that. It's actually how we handle that conflict. So the conflict isn't the bad part. It's how we handle it, and not handling it is another way of handling it. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take that final step into having those tough conversations and really look at how can we as leaders embrace these conversations, even if we don't want them, but really embrace them from the perspective of this is how we're going to build and create really healthy teams. So the biggest thing that I'm going to just call out is that confrontation typically feels uncomfortable, right? Like nobody, you guys have heard me say before, nobody gets up in the morning and says, hey, I'm going to fail today. Well, none of us as leaders wakes up in the morning and says, I hope I have a really awkward conversation today. Like that's just not something that we do as leaders either. But the thing is leadership, as we know, isn't about avoiding discomfort. Leadership is really about stepping into it, leaning into it, and figuring out how do we make this discomfort work for us. So when we avoid confrontation, what is happening is we're allowing those poor behaviors to kind of go unchecked. And by doing that, we're sending the message that standards don't matter, that accountability doesn't matter, and that that's optional, and that the culture we're building is negotiable. Okay, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So when we choose to address an issue head on, right? If we do it directly and respectfully and in a way that we're building trust and building the relationship, then we send a very different message to our teams. And that message is that our team matters, you as an employee matter, because typically what happens when we avoid those challenging conversations, it's not the person who needs the conversation who sees it as being accepted. It tends to be the team members who don't need that difficult conversation, who now start to say, well, if that person's not doing it, then why should I do it? And that's where we start to run into the challenge. So what we want to focus on is making sure that in all of these conversations, we're still focusing on what matters, and that's the relationship. So think about it this way. If you think about every sort of breakthrough that you've ever had, whether in your personal life, your work life, it probably started with some level of tension. probably started with a little bit of discomfort. Maybe somebody confronted you on something. Maybe you had to confront somebody on something. But confrontation, when it's done well, when it's done with clarity, and when it's done with care, is not a bad thing. It's actually leadership in action. So it's the moment that we stop having, where we stop hoping, that problems just magically disappear, which they never do. And instead step into how can we actually guide somebody through this situation. That's where the magic in leadership can really come into play. So I want us to focus on the reality that avoidance erodes trust. So let's talk about this a little bit, because for many of us, the unfortunate go-to strategy tends to be avoidance. When conflict shows up, we kind of take the, if I ignore it, maybe it'll go away mentality towards it. We avoid. We might say to ourselves, it'll all work out, it'll all pass. And the reality is it doesn't actually keep the peace. It tends to erode trust and make trust go away, which is obviously not what any of us are trying to do. When we avoid dealing with poor behaviors, two things tend to happen. First, the person whose behavior is off track gets no feedback. And without feedback, how can somebody fix something, right? Like I've always looked at it and thought about it from the perspective of it's not actually fair to not give somebody feedback, because without the feedback, they don't have the ability to grow and transform. Okay. They probably don't know the impact that it's having. Okay. But the second, and I already mentioned this, the second challenge is the rest of the team sees what's going on. They see that the behavior is being tolerated. And this is when their trust in you as a leader actually starts to worsen and weaken and break down. So the absence of having that conflict, like avoiding the conflict, isn't peace. Like I think we sometimes hope it will be. It's that silence in a team is actually dangerous, because it tells people that I don't feel safe speaking up. I don't trust that issues will be handled at all, let alone properly. So avoidance, as easy as it feels in the short term, tends to backfire on us in the long term. So this is why we're trying to sort of look at some of these things today and figure out, okay, how do I as a leader not avoid and instead feel more confident in the confrontation? So let's talk about emotional intelligence in confrontation. So when we think about it from this perspective, and I always struggle with, do we use the word confrontation? What word should we use? Because confrontation has that negative feeling to it. But the reality is it is confronting, and sometimes it's confronting ourselves as much as we're confronting somebody else. So if we think about it, confrontation doesn't mean aggressive. Confrontation doesn't mean abrasive, right? It doesn't mean storming into the room, slamming doors and yelling. It really is, it's about having the tough conversations when they need to be had. So in order for us to do that, we need self-awareness, we need candor, and we need emotional regulation. So if you think about that self-awareness side of things, this is for you to start with you, right? And ask yourself, what are my triggers? What are the things that I feel when I have to have those conversations? What are my fears? What are the stories that I'm telling myself about the other person? What are the stories I'm telling myself about their reaction, right? Am I walking into the conversation ready to attack, or am I walking into the conversation trying to understand, right? Where am I in terms of my own self-awareness of why this might be challenging for me, and what does that lead me to do? So if we think and remember, emotional intelligence is us understanding how we use our feelings to manage situations, relationships, and to essentially go about life. So what are our own feelings in this conversation? That second step, candor, is really focusing on clear and concise facts. So we talk a lot about focusing on facts, not stories. So this is where we're talking about the actual behaviors that we've seen, or the actual things that have happened, very fact-based. No emotion. We're focusing on those truths, right? And so instead of sort of dancing around the issue, this is where we get and like dropping hints. Like this is where we do need to be really clear. Brene Brown says, "Clear is kind, and unclear is unkind," and that's what we're trying to do here. And then that final piece is that emotional regulation, right? So we talk a lot about responding versus reacting, right? So we want to really understand that in confrontation, when we're having these tough conversations, emotions can rise. And so if we know that emotions can rise, that's why it's important for us to put ourselves in the right headspace first, so that we can be there to sort of do what we can to have people respond versus react. But also, we need to focus, we can only control us. So it's really about controlling our own responses in those situations. So recognizing for yourself, what are some things that I can do if I feel the emotion rising, right? Do I need to take a break? Do I need to take a deep breath? How do I self-regulate in those tough conversations if things start to maybe get a little bit heated? Okay. The big focus, though, is making sure that we're navigating that conversation with honesty, with clarity, and with respect through the whole thing. So if we focus on our first takeaway for today, it's the fact that candor actually builds psychological safety. And I know that sometimes can feel a little bit counterintuitive, right? But look at it from this perspective. If you and I are working together, and you see me tolerating bad behavior, what message does that send? Versus, and that message probably is, this isn't a safe space, right? This isn't a safe place. If bad behavior happens, it's not addressed. Poor behavior gets a pass. Do I want to work in an environment where that's okay? Versus, if I have the courage to actually confront somebody, talk about things respectfully, that creates a psychologically safe space. Because it says to other people and to me that honesty matters, that accountability matters, and that respect matters. And that is how we create a psychologically safe workplace. So it's about understanding that candor is actually the thing that builds that type of workplace. Okay. So the second takeaway for today is that we call people in and not out. And that's how we build respect and trust. So if we think about this, calling out is about sort of shaming, right? Like that's about making somebody feel bad. I used to work somewhere where we talked about catching people doing things right instead of catching people doing things wrong. And so if we call people out, it's telling them they're wrong. It's telling them they failed. It's telling them they're the problem. That's not what we're trying to do. When we call people in, it says, I value you enough to be honest with you. I value you enough to want you to be successful. I value you enough to give you the information you need in order to create change so you can stay. Having that calling in conversation really speaks to the fact that I care about you enough to want you to be able to do this better. And that's a big mindset shift. But once we can really get that into our culture and into ourselves as leaders to understand that having the conversation is actually the kindest thing we can do, that's a really big thing. So when we call people in, it builds respect, it builds trust, it allows you to have that conversation about the behaviors that aren't okay without tearing down the person, because it's not about the person, it's about the behaviors, right? So we want to be able to externalize the behaviors from the person, because it's not the person that's the problem, it's what they're doing that's the problem, or what they're not doing that's the problem. So the next time that you need to confront somebody, I want to challenge you to ask yourself, how can I frame this in a way sort of as an invitation? How can I frame this so that it's not an attack, but instead it's a trying to bring them into alignment? If you remember last session when we talked about accountability, we were really focusing on alignment. So instead of calling out and blaming, it's about how do we get ourselves back aligned? Okay. Checking on my time, I am doing okay. So I want to give you a tool, and full disclosure, not my tool. So this tool comes from the Vital Smart series. So crucial accountabilities, crucial conversations, influencer, change anything. These are some of the books that they have. And one of the tools that they use is this whole concept of CPR. So what conversation needs to happen? So what tends to happen a lot of the time is we tend to have a lot of C conversations, content conversations, when we actually need to be having a different conversation. So let's talk through what each of these are, and then we can kind of talk about what that looks like. So a content conversation, a C conversation, is focusing on a single event that has happened. Okay, so the like nice simple thing that I like to always use is somebody's late for work. Okay, we live in a world where lateness actually matters. It doesn't necessarily as much anymore because of working from home, but let's pretend we do. So somebody is late for work. The first time it happens, the first conversation we're having is a C conversation. I need to talk to you about the fact that you were late today. Okay, that's a C conversation. That's a content conversation. The P is pattern. And so the pattern conversation, let's pretend I've had a C conversation already. I've already talked to you once about the fact that you were late. Okay. I'm no longer talking to you in that next conversation. If you've continued to be late, I'm not talking to you anymore about the fact you were late. I'm actually talking to you about the fact that we've had this conversation before. You've been late multiple times. This is now a pattern of behavior. So in a content conversation, it's probably more of an accountability conversation in the sense of it's like, hey, we could pick on Jen because she's behind the camera today. Hey, Jen, you were late for this meeting today. I really want to have a conversation so we can figure out how that doesn't happen again. Okay, and then Jen and I probably come to an agreement as to how that's not going to happen again. Maybe it's about giving more of a buffer time in our schedule. Maybe if I'm late for work, it's because the bus comes and I can either be right on time or be 20 minutes early. And it's hard for me to get out of the house and be 20 minutes early. So we have a conversation, address that, whatever it is, right? We make a commitment to each other in terms of how we're going to avoid the late again. Okay. But in that pattern conversation, we're not talking about the late. Now we're talking about the fact that this has happened again. We already created a plan as to how it wouldn't happen again. So now we need to address, is the plan the problem? Or what's actually getting in the way? Because now we already came up with a plan. That plan didn't work. It's still lateness. Like now it's a bigger impact. It's a bigger conversation. The easier conversation is to have that content conversation again. That's an easy conversation. But the right conversation is now to address that pattern conversation. Okay. Now, the tough one, the R conversation, the relationship. So this is when the behavior is actually starting to damage the relationship. It's either impacting your trust, it's impacting your connection, whatever that is. So if you think about what's happened, Jen was late. Now, Jen's been late repeatedly. We've created multiple plans. Now, what tends to happen is not saying it's right, but now I, as somebody who's had this conversation multiple times, created the plan a couple times, now I start to put my own stuff into the situation. I start to tell myself, Jen's not respecting me, or I start to tell myself, Jen doesn't care what I think. Jen doesn't care about the job. There's a story now that starts to happen. But regardless of what that, and the reason that story is happening is because Jen's given me commitments and they haven't been followed through on. So now that this story is starting to happen, now it actually starts to damage the relationship, right? Now we're starting to get into the point where it's not about the lateness anymore. Now the conversation I need to have is actually about how I am feeling and what it's making me feel like when it comes to our relationship. And that's a really tough conversation. Now we're getting into the harder conversation because now it's more about my connection to you. It's more about how you're making me feel. So the mistake that we tend to make as leaders is we get stuck in having that easy conversation instead of moving through the conversations. Because again, if I just now have the same conversation about lateness, that's one thing. And if I'm Jen, I might go, Mel, just having the same conversation again, but it loses traction every time I have to have that conversation. Because if I've had it multiple times, the impression that I'm giving to Jen is that it actually doesn't matter that much to me. Right. But if I say, hey, Jen, like we've talked about this multiple times, we've had this conversation a few times. Now, I'm not saying you are doing this on purpose, but what I'm starting to feel is that you actually don't respect me as a leader. That might not be what you're doing or what you're saying, but that's actually now what I'm telling myself. And I don't want that for us because I want us to figure out how we can work together. So what do we need to do to move that forward? Okay. And so that's the right conversation we should be having, because that's the conversation that will hopefully get us unstuck. And so that's where, if we stay sort of stuck in that easy conversation, it tends to lead to bigger stuff. So we always want to ask ourselves, what is the right conversation I should be having? And the other thing we need to ask ourselves always is, do I need to have this conversation? And because sometimes we don't need to have every conversation, and that's okay too. But recognizing when we choose not to have them, there's a consequence to that as well. But it does not mean we need to address absolutely everything all the time, anytime it happens. It's more about choosing what and then choosing if, and in deciding in those conversations. So all of that to say that behavior shapes culture. So behavior is what actually shapes culture. So if we continuously let bad behavior slide, we're building a culture of bad behaviors, because it's not actually defined by the value statement. It's not defined by the things that are put on the wall. It's defined by the behaviors that actually happen and what we tolerate within the workplace. What, by acknowledging or not acknowledging, we're reinforcing. And so whatever we reinforce is what becomes culture. It doesn't matter what the poster or the plaque says. So every time we avoid confrontation, we're essentially teaching the team that something's acceptable. And so you really need to ask yourself, is this something I want everybody else doing? Because that's where it may eventually come down to. So cheesy example, think about cameras on during meetings. Okay, so you're a remote workplace. The expectation is cameras on. There's one person who doesn't have their camera on one day. It's not addressed. And so they don't have it on the next time. And they don't have it on the next time. Well, what starts to happen is I look at this as an employee and I see that, well, Sally shows up to these meetings and never has her camera on. So maybe today I'm not going to have my camera on because I didn't get up in time. Well, now there's two people without cameras on. And then that starts to get reinforced over and over again. And then all of a sudden you're confused as to why cameras on is no longer, has now become like an unofficial rule. And it's actually now just cameras off is kind of what everybody's doing. And now again, we've got to have that bigger conversation of what happened. And it's never about the person who broke the culture. It's always about you as a leader is what it will come down to when that starts to happen. So we have to really think about the fact that one person's actions can really have that ripple effect across the organization. So as small as some things sound, we want to pay attention to it. We want to understand the value of actually correcting that one individual before it becomes a bigger thing. Okay. So third takeaway for today. So confrontation, 100%, it requires courage. We know that. Avoidance is super comfortable. It's why it's easier to do. It's why lots of us tend to do it, but it does start to wreck trust and performance within an organization. So every time that we as leaders choose courage over comfort, yucky, we build our credibility as a leader. Good. Okay. So courage over comfort doesn't feel great, but credibility as a leader does feel good. So my challenge here is for you to really step into those hard conversations, to lean into them, not with aggression and not with avoidance, but just with some clarity, some candor, and some respect. The more that we can do that, the better it is. So your team doesn't need you to be perfect at these conversations. They just need you to be courageous, and courage will always win out over the whole idea of avoidance. Okay. So it's hard. It's not easy. I'm not going to sit here and say it's easy. It's just the right way to approach it. So that's our third takeaway for today. So all of that to say, when we create a culture of the fact that we can have these conversations, we can address things with candor, we can address things with respect, we can have honesty, it actually starts to have sort of a valuable side effect. And that side effect is that healthy conflict, healthy confrontation now actually can breed healthy conflict. And conflict within the workplace is a positive thing. Conflict within the workplace, healthy conflict within the workplace, sparks innovation, creativity, a whole bunch of good stuff. So if we can actually create a culture where confrontation is handled well, it actually says to people, conflict is okay. We can have these conversations and it feels good. We can have these conversations and they're not a threat. They're not a sign of lack of safety. It's actually a sign of safety, right? So in the environments where people aren't afraid to disagree, where we can challenge ideas, and that's seen as a good thing, where we can push for better solutions because, maybe that idea worked 2 years ago, but I have an idea as to how we could do it better now. And I'm not afraid to say it because I can disagree and that be okay. That is where innovation happens. That's where creativity is sparked. That's where really good things start to come. So what we're trying to do is recognize that how we address things in the really hard conversations, because they are the ones that are critical, that actually sets the whole team up for understanding and feeling the power that confrontation can be uncomfortable, but it doesn't mean we avoid it. It actually means we lean into it, because when we do, that's when we get that sort of unlock of the better, which is that idea that healthy conflict starts to be sparked and safety is big. And when that safety is there, then that leads to growth, creativity, and all the good stuff. So we want to recognize that that's kind of the added side benefit of doing this work. So all of that to say, conflict, not the enemy. Okay. It's the reality in every workplace. It's a good reality in every workplace. What matters is actually how we deal with that conflict, knowing that avoidance is not the right way to deal with it. When we do it well, when we do it with honesty, when we do it with emotional intelligence, it's how we build trust and how we build psychological safety. When we use candor and we practice candor, then that is where psychological safety comes from. Courage is creating the culture, and all of a sudden really cool stuff happens, because once we've built that foundation, then conflict doesn't seem scary. It actually becomes a thing that acts as like a fuel and as an accelerant within a great organization and a great team. So my invitation to you as we wrap up our series is that not to fear confrontation, but instead to face it with courage, call people in, not out. Okay. Protect your culture and watch how your team becomes stronger. Watch how they become braver, and watch how more innovation happens because of it. So I want you to take what you've learned today into two opportunities. Opportunity number one, at AWL Partners, we do EQI assessments. So I invite you to perhaps look at that as something that you incorporate into your fall learning strategy. So understanding how your emotions affect you as a leader. If the idea of having these conversations seems really scary still, perhaps having that EQI assessment so that you can consider, how do I bring my emotions to work? What are the things that impact me? Could help you with conflict and confrontation as a leader. The second way that I invite you to consider what we talked about today would be through going into the Actually I Can hub and exploring some different resources. We've built a number of resources in there, ways to have tough conversations, some other tools that you can use to have, I'll say, important conversations the right way, some things to consider for yourself when it comes to self-awareness. Those resources are in there and they're available to members, have access to all of them for free, and community members have access to some of them for free, but they're in that Actually I Can hub. So definitely go in there and take a look. As always, you can interact with us and engage with us so many ways, coaching and counseling as an individual. We do have some masterminds starting in October if you're interested in that, or if you're looking to bring more stuff to your workplace, whether it's training, facilitation, any support like that, just send us a message or email hello@awlpartners.com and we would gladly help out. Have an absolutely amazing day. We are finished right on time. Thank you for joining us for this series. We were really excited to have you, and I would love to continue this journey with you. So just reach out and we will help however we can. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.